to be here. And I think the theme of today, in terms of diversity, leadership, inclusivity, futures, is a really, really exciting one to really get our minds thinking in terms of how we as leaders in higher education can do things differently to make sure that our students get the best possible deal, because they are our future. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Maria Klawe, who is president of Harvey Mudd College, where she's been for over 10 years now. Prior to that, at Princeton, she was Dean of Engineering and also Professor of Computing Science. So I think a wonderful role model going back quite some way. In terms of what she's going to be speaking to you about over the next half hour, she's going to be talking about empowering change in academia, so very much following on from our theme of today. And I think you can expect to hear about gender, race, inclusivity, and raising ambition. Over to you, Maria.
Somebody asked me why I agreed to come all the way to Brisbane, and the truth is I love birds. And I was in Brisbane once before and was absolutely stunned by the birdsong. And so this morning, as I was walking here from the Hilton, I heard this sound, and it sounded like it was coming from high up in a building. In any other place, I would have said, okay, that's a machine. It was like, shoo-wah, shoo-wah, but it was a bird. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the path to diversity and inclusion at Harvey Mudd College. I'm going to start by telling you something about Harvey Mudd, because raise your hand if you'd never heard of Harvey Mudd before you came to this. Yes, thank you very much. Harvey Mudd is a tiny college. We have about 800 students. I love that. I know about half of them by name. It's probably one of the very few places you could be a college president, wear a t-shirt most days, and know most of the students. We are the Science and Engineering College of the Claremont Colleges. There are 5 undergraduate colleges in Claremont. They're side by side, literally, and 2 graduate institutions. We are, despite the fact that you've never heard of us, we are one of the top undergraduate science and engineering institutions in the world. We compete for our students with MIT and Caltech and Stanford and Berkeley, so very, very good students. But we're totally different from any place you've ever seen. So number one, we have crappy grades. In 7,000 alumni, we've had 7, and 3 of them happened during my time at Harvey Mudd, 7 who graduated with a 4.0. So we just don't like to give A's. Our students don't compete with each other. In fact, it's every student's responsibility to help every other student succeed. We encourage collaboration from day one. We are the students who know how to communicate. We emphasize writing and oral communications, teamwork, creativity, all of the things that in fact were on that list of, but the really funny thing is we were started, our first students arrived in 57, we were officially founded in 55. So we're not young enough to be in this collection, but we're pretty young. And we were started with all the things I've just told you about. These are not recent things. These are things that were part of the founding, part of the vision for who Harvey Mudd College would be. Now, I'm the first woman to hold my position for the last 29 years. And one of the things that I've been passionate about since a very young age is making science and engineering more supportive of women. And that's because when I was growing up, everything I liked were stuff that was reserved for boys. Everything. And my father thought I was a boy. I thought I was a boy. That actually was very helpful because it meant that my parents were I just didn't matter what I said. If I was going to do math, engineering, they said, yeah, that's really good. But as my career has progressed, and I'm one of the oldest people in the room now, except Terry Reid is 8 years older than me. As my career has progressed, I've started to realize that if I wanted to change the culture of science and engineering, I couldn't do it from Canada. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Canada, educated in Canada, but I couldn't do it from there because most of the culture of science and engineering, unfortunately, is set in the United States. And Canada is totally invisible to the United States. So after 15 years at the University of British Columbia, which I absolutely adored, I moved to Princeton with the goal of really trying to change the culture of science and engineering. And then moved from there to Harvey Mudd, because one of the things I thought is that a lot of what happens in terms of exclusion, both for women, for people of color, for LGBTQ students, a lot of that happens in undergraduate education. And so if we're really going to change that culture, I need to be at a place that cares more about education than anything else, a place that cares about innovation, a place that actually does assessment, because we innovate all the time in education, but we don't check whether it actually made a difference. And so that's how I got to Harvey Mudd College. Now, I'm going to show you some statistics. So my first year there, the incoming students were 24% female, 2% black, and 5% Hispanic. The faculty was about a third female. That's very high for an elite science and engineering institution. 1% black and a bit less than 4% Hispanic. And there was one female department chair, and in fact, in the 50 years that Harvey Mudd had been around, there were exactly 2 instances where there had been a female department chair of a department. Okay, how about the beginning of this year? Well, actually, we're a little bit low on women this year. We have come in as high as 52% female. This year was 46% female. Multiple of 5 in terms of African American black students, multiple of 4 in terms of Hispanic students. We've been working on our faculty as well. We are up to 40% female, 4% black, and less progress on Hispanic. One of the issues is that, I mean, it's really hard to believe, but there are a lot more African Americans graduating with PhDs in science and engineering than Hispanic graduates, and so it's just harder to recruit. And 6 of our 7 department chairs are female. Now, that means we have, right this second, we have the first ever female chair of the math department, the engineering department, the computer science department, the physics department, and the chemistry department. And you know, a lot of what I'm going to tell you about was very deliberate. And I get a huge amount of credit for the transitions that have happened at Harvey Mudd. I didn't do it. The only reason this worked is because our community decided to work on it. And in particular, the fact that we have all these female department chairs is the consequence of all of the diversity and inclusion training that we've done much more broadly. It's not something we put into our department chair selection process at all. It just happened. Okay, so I'll just say when I arrived at Harvey Mudd, in spite of the fact that I had chosen to go to Harvey Mudd to prove that you could have, you know, very successful people of color and women in every area of science and engineering, I hadn't actually talked to enough people at the community about how people felt about diversity. Big mistake. So, you know, I'm at my first board meeting. There's like 40 people on my board. There are 5 women, counting me, on the board who are female. The average age is like 75. And, you know, I say something about diversity and they go, oh, no, you know, I mean, we're a merit-based institution. And the only reason we don't have a lot of women or people of color because they're not really interested in science and engineering. If we were to become more diverse, we'd have to lower our standards. Not an auspicious beginning. However, the first thing we were going to do was start strategic planning. And in fact, the board had wanted the previous president to do a strategic plan, and he wasn't that enthusiastic about it. And so, you know, when I arrived, when I was being recruited, first thing you got to do is a strategic plan. Well, I think one of the reasons that they chose me is because when I went to Princeton, we did a strategic planning exercise. And I will just say, when I was negotiating to become Dean of Engineering at Princeton, I'm talking to the president, and all of the faculty have told me, ask for more resources, we need more resources. But I didn't know enough about the details to be specific. So I said, if we do a strategic plan, and if the entire university supports the plan, and the entire board supports the plan, will you fundraise for us to get those resources? And she said, sure. Well, okay, I get myself into these stupid problems all the time. I hadn't asked the faculty about strategic planning, and it turns out they had no interest in doing a strategic plan whatsoever, because the previous dean had done a strategic plan and they hated it. So we had to figure out a way that we could do a strategic plan the faculty would actually support. And so we, about 5 of us, literally from scratch, constructed this strategic planning approach that the main values of which are complete transparency, inviting everybody to participate, so including students, which was a never heard of at Princeton. And you know, I feel like the student who was talking about her relationship with the vice chancellor at our MIT, I sort of feel that way about the students I work with, because I figure students are probably the people who know best about what their experience is. So we did this. And the strategic plan that we created at Princeton, it was so strongly supported by the faculty that when I announced I was leaving to go to Harvey Mudd, the department chairs en masse went to see the president to say, it's not Maria's plan, it's our plan, and you can't recruit an external dean of engineering because they'll want to do their own plan, and this is our plan. And so, and Shirley said, no way, we always do an external search. Well, they did an internal search. They kept the same plan for 12 years. They now have a new dean who's, again, an internal candidate, and they're thinking about revising it. But, I mean, that tells you that it was their plan, not my plan. So we used a very similar process when I got to Mudd. We launched a strategic vision for the college at the beginning of February in 2007. We're still on the same plan. We'll be on that plan for at least another 4 years. So, key components. First of all, open to everyone. So faculty, so that's for us, faculty means academic staff, students, professional staff, alumni, trustees, parents, and literally people off the street. Anybody could come and participate. We had 1/3 of our students participate in strategic planning. So at the time we had about 750 students, 250 participated in it. Every single idea that is expressed is on an open website that everybody can read. We started out by inviting everyone who wanted to suggest topics we should discuss. We placed them in buckets and chose the buckets so that no matter what topic it was going to be, every single constituent would be engaged in that. Because when we were doing this at Engineering Princeton, we had departments that were so siloed that there were people who'd been in 2 separate departments for 20 years who'd never met, even though their research interests overlapped. And so we wanted to make sure we brought them all together. So we did a similar thing at Mudd. Our biggest way of making sure that we really had our faculty involved is we made about 2/3 of the faculty serve on steering committees to organize workshops. And the reason for doing that is if they're involved in organizing, they'll actually come. But we also had students, alumni, trustees, staff on every steering committee as well. A steering committee would have about 15 people. We very deliberately, because there's this thing, in most places, you're more, the people who've been there longer and who are full professors and department chairs have a louder voice, get listened to more than junior people who are untenured. And at Princeton, we were going to have Nobel laureates and undergraduate students, and we needed a way that we could hear everyone. And so we made the steering committees that way. We also trained our steering committees in protocols to listen well. And you know, probably both at Princeton and Harvey Mudd, one of the best things we did was that training. Because imagine if 2/3 of your academic staff actually were trained in how to listen incredibly well to each other. Changes your culture. After each workshop, we posted a 3-page summary. Based on those summaries, we put together a draft PowerPoint of the strategic vision. Now, one of the key things that we did while we were at Princeton is, in presenting the PowerPoint draft of the strategic vision, we presented it in edit mode, right? Not in that mode, but when you can actually type in things. And as people made suggestions, we in real time added them to the PowerPoint. So every presentation we did at Princeton, we must have done, I don't know, 20 presentations, one for every department, one for the students, one for the trustees, one for alumni at events all over the country, et cetera. At Mudd, we probably only did 10 presentations. And I remember getting a critical email from a recent Mudd alum saying, boy, your PowerPoint doesn't look professional at all. You have a typo there and you don't have, and I was going, yeah, this is a real-time thing. We're doing this to show that we're actually responding. And then after we'd presented and edited it many, many times, basically we wrote a document. And in both cases, I worked with one of our communications staff to actually do the writing because I was the only individual who had been at every single presentation and heard everything that was said. And our whole idea was lift the level of abstraction up one level. Because it's the details that people disagree with. And so if you actually want to bring people together, just lift the level of abstraction. Okay, so, and then the final part of this, and we did this both at Mudd at Princeton, is to have some resources to enable you to have some low-hanging fruit successes in the first year or two after you launch. Because the problem is most of the things you put in the plan are going to take a while. And you've got to have a sense of momentum, a sense of that things are actually happening. Now, I mean, just to give you the difference between Princeton and Harvey Mudd, at Princeton, that was $2 million was the fund for low-hanging fruit. At Harvey Mudd, it was 100,000. But in both places, it had exactly the same impact. That, you know, people, and the people who suggested what could happen were students, they were alumni, they were staff, could be anyone. And we got enough things done that we had the sense of momentum. So let me come back to diversity. I already told you what the attitude to diversity was before. We're a merit-based institution. Increasing diversity means lowering standards. And afterwards, one of the themes, and this was also true at Princeton as well as at Harvey Mudd, so both places ended up with diversity being one of the objectives that we were going to pursue. At Mudd, it was framed as unsurpassed excellence and diversity at all levels. And the unsurpassed excellence is there to combat this idea that bring in more female students, more students of color, more whatever, going to lower the standards. Now, I would say that when we went through the strategic planning exercise, we probably got 75% of our community on board. And the most influential people are your academic staff. They're the people who are there for longest. They're the people whose attitudes and whose culture is going to influence what's actually going on in your classrooms, and in your research labs, which is, you know, what's going to make students feel either welcome and embraced or not. We certainly had some pretty vocal naysayers, mostly older faculty and older alumni. And what we think is that our pro-diversity faculty, staff, students, and trustees are empowered to drive change. And I wrote, we hope. I'll explain more. Okay, so in 2007 and 2008, we held diversity workshops for our academic staff and our professional staff. And I would say 2/3 of our academic staff participated, and also a good chunk of our professional staff. What we realized after we did the second one was we'd probably gotten everybody who we could persuade to go to it. And you know, there's been some research published recently that shows that mandatory diversity training is not nearly as effective as optional diversity training. And moreover, you want to have your own members of your community do your diversity training if possible, because mandatory, particularly with outsiders, doesn't work so well. We redesigned all of our admission materials. Now, when you're a dean of engineering at any engineering school in the US, every single engineering school publishes a magazine 3 or 4 times a year. And as dean of engineering at Princeton, I would just flip through the pages and look where there were women represented. And you would get examples where there might be 1,000 people in a magazine where not one was female. And so one of the things that if you really want to be a diverse institution, one of the things you've got to do is you've actually got to look diverse, which means that all of our admission materials, but also everything on our website, our tour guides, just all of it has to portray who you want to be. For my first 4 years, I wrote a handwritten card to every admitted female student. I did that because, so that would be about 300 students. It wouldn't work at a place like QUT. Well, actually, it might work at a place like QUT, since I know that the Vice Chancellor actually reads every student comment on the surveys that they do every semester. The reason we were doing that was our yield on female students was lower than our yield on male students. So we know from research that women are more likely to respond to a personal approach. And I stopped doing it after 4 years because our yield went up to being equal to the male students. So the major that had the least women in it in 2006 when I arrived was the computer science major. And I don't know how many of you know that computer science is the only area of science and engineering where participation by women has declined over the last 30 years rather than increased. And Carla said something about this. The number at research universities in the US is about 14% female right now. We were at 10%. And again, this is something I get tons of credit for. I didn't do any of it because they started working on it the year before I arrived. But it took them 4 years to get to 40% female. And we just graduated in 2016, our first group of CS graduates that was more than 50%. It was actually 54% or something like that, female. We created 2 associate dean positions for diversity, one in student affairs and one on the faculty side. We now have both engineering and physics majors close to 50% female. We have diversity training for every faculty search committee. Now, recruiting more women was relatively easy. Why is that? If you look at the people who are graduating from high schools in the United States with the absolutely top academic preparation, the top scores, 50% of those students are female. If you want to understand the situation for black students, particularly recruiting for a place like Mudd that is one of both the most rigorous curriculums in the country, tougher than MIT, and probably about the same as Caltech. The problem with black students is there are so few black students that graduate with that level of preparation every year. So if you look at the total United States, about 250 of the students that graduate each year who are interested in science and engineering are African American and have the kind of preparation that would get them into a place like Harvey Mudd or MIT. 250. So the fact that we're now managing to bring in about 20 black students each year in our incoming class, that's amazing. And in order to be able to recruit those black students, we had to learn what black families think about when they're choosing a place for their student. Because if a black student with the kind of scores that would get them into MIT or Harvey Mudd applies to Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Stanford, they'll get in every single place they applied. Turns out that black families want their student to go to the best known place that they got into. And MIT, Caltech, Stanford, I bet you guys had all heard of those places. Not many people knew about Harvey Mudd, so I had to figure out a way that we could become much more visible. And now in the US, we really are very visible. We are sort of the poster child for diversity in science and engineering, particularly gender diversity. The way I got to that, I went and visited a woman named Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl Sandberg, I'm sure you all know, is the COO at Facebook. She's absolutely passionate about women in tech. And so somebody sent me a link to her TED Talk about women in tech. I watched it. I got a 15-minute appointment with her. Lasted an hour and 15 minutes. She'd never met anyone who knew about getting more women into computer science. And at the end of the meeting, I said, Sheryl, you know, you could really help us. You could talk about Harvey Mudd when you're talking about women in tech. You could point out that we actually know how to get women into computer science. And she said, done. And so that meeting was in June. I went back for another meeting in July. In August, she was on a panel talking about women in tech, among other things, and she gave us a big shout out. In the 12 months after she did that, there were 60 stories in the media about Harvey Mudd and women in computer science. New York Times, Business Week, PBS, The New Yorker, Time Magazine, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And, you know, she not only did it herself, but she also asked several of her friends like Megan Smith, who was the CTO at the White House at Google X before that, Marissa Mayer, and they all talked about us as well. But recruiting Hispanic students was totally different. Turns out Hispanic students want to stay close to home. And we are right in the greater Los Angeles area in a large Hispanic population. There's only one issue. The local high schools, public schools, are awful. So we had to change the amount of support we provide for our students so that we could actually recruit the top student from a local high school and have them actually be able to succeed at Harvey Mudd. So we invested a ton of resources into providing more support for first-year students. And I'm very happy to say, so we're in our second year of having a very large, so 20% Hispanic classes in our first year and in our sophomore year. And they, on balance, are doing as well as the white students. So it's not enough to get students in the door, or faculty in the door for that matter. You actually have to make sure that they're going to thrive. And so we have done a ton of stuff in terms of providing more support. We have probably 2 training sessions on diversity and inclusion programming a week. We created a social justice living and learning community, the first time we've ever had something like that. And the bottom line is, we get up every day and we say we're not perfect. We try really hard, but we very deliberately say we're not perfect so that we can actually be thinking about how to get better. And I told Peter that I almost canceled this trip because we have a crisis right now at Harvey Mudd. Now, I'll come back to empowering leaders for a moment. And one of the issues is that as we have recruited a much more diverse set of students, we have much more student protests than we've ever had before. And this is partly because of what's going on in the United States with Donald Trump, and before that with Black Lives Matter. And yes, we have a Black Lives and Allies group at Harvey Mudd. And I think it's partly just a microcosm of what's going on in the country, but it's just much more challenging than it's ever been in the past. So one of the issues that we have at Harvey Mudd for both our students and for our academic staff is we work too hard. And it's partly, you know, in the US, the standard workload is 4 courses per semester. For us, it's about 6. And so that's 50% higher. But also I would say compared to, say, a Princeton course, a Mudd course is like twice as challenging, something like that, twice as much work. We also, our faculty, our academic staff teach 5 courses per year. And they put a huge amount of effort into it. And we did a complete revision of our core curriculum 8 years ago after strategic planning to try and reduce the workload. So we did things like going from a requirement of 4 semesters of math to 3. But we didn't take out a full semester's amount of work when we made that change. We just sort of said, well, we can do it faster somehow. Well, of course, what's the result? It's actually more work instead of less work. And so we have been studying this issue about excessive student and faculty workload for quite a while. And about 18 months ago, we had an external group come in to do a review. And somewhat deliberately, the group that brought them in decided to make sure that they heard from both the vocal faculty who are resistant to the fact that we brought in more women and students of color, as well as others. And they heard from students who were really suffering from the workload, as well as others. And when they wrote the report, which was a 50-page document, they emphasized the negative things they'd heard from the students and from the faculty. And the faculty decided, in order to try and encourage faculty to take action about this, to share it with all faculty members. And that happened about a year ago. And there's been lots and lots of discussion about what we should change and all that kind of stuff. But the student newspaper at the Claremont Colleges 2 weeks ago published a story about this and released the full report so that everyone had it. And needless to say, our students, and particularly our students of color, were absolutely outraged that, first of all, we didn't release it a year ago, and that secondly, some of the things that, some of the quotes, not identifiable, but quotes from faculty saying, basically, we can't teach you because you're not well enough prepared. And so for the last 2 weeks, we've had a protest, we've had a community forum, we've had a lot of tears. I can't possibly go into all the details that underlie it, but it's been very, very tough. And in particular, what's so hard is that it's probably 15% of our faculty maximum who would have made some of those comments that are so upsetting to our students. The other 85% have been turning themselves inside out in order to embrace the new student body we have and have done so much to help. And of course, so now we have some of our students are very angry and very vocal. Some of our students are upset that those students are being angry and vocal. And we have 85% of our faculty that is feeling absolutely betrayed because they have worked so hard to support the students and they're being attacked. And then we have another 15% of our faculty who feels betrayed because the report was leaked. We will get through it. I actually think that the dialogue that's going on is extraordinarily helpful because we need to listen to people. And one of the things that is just true about Mudd is we don't like to have disagreement among our faculty. And so if somebody says something that somebody disagrees with, often nobody will speak up. It will just go by. And now we're having those conversations that are extremely difficult, but I think really important. So let me go back to empowering leaders for change. So one of the things we've been thinking about very explicitly is we have an enormous percentage of our faculty that is interested in leadership. I would guess there might be, when we just did a search for the Dean of the Faculty, that's our Provost or Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs equivalent, we had 14 people nominated for the position and 8 decided to go, and this is internally, decided to actually go into it. The incoming Dean of the Faculty will be our first female Dean of the Faculty that we've had so far. We have, of course, we have 7 department chairs. We have 4 associate deans of the faculty. We have a new professor of leadership. This is very controversial for us. A lot of our faculty would have said, and our board, you can't teach leadership. Well, my feeling is you're either born a leader or you're not. My belief is everyone has some leadership skills and everyone can get better. And so we have our Annenberg Professor of Leadership, Werner Zorman, comes to us from industry, who's having a huge impact. And what I see happening is that the vast majority of our leaders now are relatively young people. So they're associate professors or just turned full professor. And they are much more open to change than the department chairs that we had 10 years ago. So I want to open it up for questions and comments. I'm incredibly proud of what has happened at Harvey Mudd. It wouldn't have been possible without really extraordinary commitments. I mentioned our board had 5 women on it. Now it has 15. It'll be 17 by May. We have people of color on the board now, not huge numbers, about 8 out of the 40, but we're getting there. So we're moving.
Maria, thank you so much. Do take a seat. I'm sure everybody would agree with me that we're so pleased Maria didn't stay because of the crisis that she referred to, and came and shared that absolutely inspiring story of great culture change, amazing leadership. Although I think you've got that sense that actually, was it you? I think distributed leadership plays a great part. But in terms of culture change, I think that was absolutely amazing. And I think, as you say, out of the so-called crisis that's going on at the moment, I'm a firm believer that where there's conflict, people that are clued up and have had their voice listened to can work through it and come out much, much stronger. And it certainly sounds as if that's what's going on back at the ranch whilst you're here. So thank you so much for that inspirational and uplifting talk, and phenomenal results in terms of the turnaround, in terms of a really distinctive and dynamic higher education institution, which we all now know the name of and won't forget, I'm sure. Right, opening up for questions, because we do have a bit of time for a number of questions. So who'd like to go first? Right, we've got 2 hands up, one there and then here.
Do you want me to go first?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Sui Lin from DGIST, South Korea. I'm a Dean of the International Affairs. I have a question. Well, actually, Harvey Mudd College is a benchmark of our institute, so I'm very pleased to meet you here. As far as I understand, you have you focus on undergraduate course. Do you have any plan to make a graduate course? You said you spread your students to MIT, Harvard, Stanford, wherever the world top graduate schools. But I think at this moment, I think it's a time to think seriously to make a graduate course in your institute, college.
So thank you for that question. I already made myself very unpopular with some of our faculty and students by suggesting we grow from 800 to 900 students over 10 years. Most controversial thing I've done. If I really wanted to be fired, I would suggest that we start a graduate program. And we in fact did have a master's program in engineering for about 20 years. The actual degree was offered by the Claremont Graduate University. And what we realized, it was a project management master's course. And what we realized was that our strongest students were not doing that degree. And so we pride ourselves, we care about nothing other than the education of our students. And I mean, every single person who is a faculty member who comes to Harvey Mudd, that's why we're there. And I think one of the things that enables is every summer, at least a quarter of our students are doing undergraduate research. But because there are no graduate students or postdocs, we regard them as basically junior collaborators. You don't do bottle washing if you're a student in doing research in chemistry at Mudd. Even if you're a first-year student, you are there helping set research strategy, helping explore hypotheses, and when these results get presented at conferences, they're always presented by our students. And often they will be the only undergraduate students presenting at an international conference, and everybody will think they're PhD students. So we think that focusing just on undergraduate enables our students to get a kind of education they couldn't get at Caltech or MIT or Stanford. because of the absence of graduate students.
Thanks. That was very inspiring. I have two questions, and the first one is, how many of the chairs are of color?
That's a great question, and the answer is none. So, you know, the reality is, so we had, when I arrived so we're tiny, so when I arrived we probably had about 80 faculty. Now we have slightly more than 90. And we had one faculty member who's half black, half white, but didn't really identify as black at all. And we had 3 Hispanic faculty members, and you know, I would say probably 5 Asian faculty members. We're better now, but we just had our first African American female faculty member get tenure 2 years ago. We have, you know, we have brought in, we have some Indian, some Chinese, Korean, Filipino faculty members that we've hired over the last, you know, few years. But the reality is that we have been a very largely white and male institution until very recently. And so, and we also tend not to hire faculty at senior levels. We tend to hire them as assistant professors, so it will take a while before we actually have I mean, Talithia Williams is our first Associate Dean of Color, and she is just starting at the end of June in that position. So, you know, I mean, it's, we're in transition, but the transition for faculty is so much slower than the transition for students, because students are with us for 4 years and faculty is more like 35 or 40.
And my more substantive question is, in the United Kingdom, where I come from, there's a huge attainment gap between what we call BME students, black, minority, and ethnic students, and other students. And on average, the gap is about 20% in most universities. And so, for example, in my university, the BME population is about 20%, and the gap is 18%. And I'm just wondering whether, you know, there are any lessons that you've learned that you might share with us to deal with that major problem.
So I think the thing that I think the biggest thing we've learned is that if we want to bring in more students of color, so in the United States, the quality of the school that you go to, for public schools, the quality of the school that you go to is very tightly correlated with socioeconomic status. But it's also true that virtually all of the African American and Hispanic students are going to be going to public schools that are not as strong as one in, you know, a largely white Protestant neighborhood. So for us, I think the biggest thing we had to learn is how do we put that support in place so that we can have students who are very bright and very hardworking, but who have not had access to great teaching in high school. And how do we manage to admit those students and then actually help those students succeed? And one of my favorite stories is a student, and I have his permission to talk about him. His name is Fernando Fernandez. Fernando went to a school that's less than 2 miles away from Harvey Mudd College. It's the first student from that school we have ever admitted in the history of the college. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, it's right next door to us, and we've never admitted a student. So Fernando, he was going home because he's local. He was going home every weekend, and his sister was turning 15. And the celebration of the 15th birthday is a very big thing in Hispanic families, quinceañero. And so Fernando was spending like a full day every week practicing his dance for the quinceañero celebration. And you simply cannot survive at Harvey Mudd taking a day off a week. It's just not possible. And so, and by the time he realized he was too far behind, so he basically had to drop several of the courses in his first year. So right before the end of his first year, I was sitting with about 6 students, virtually all of color, and they were talking to me about their plans for the summer. And Fernando told me, he told me about his experience and the mistake about practicing for the quinceañera and all that kind of thing. And I said, so what are you going to do this summer? He says, oh, I'm going to community college. I'm going to take advanced calculus, multivariable calculus. And I said, why are you doing that? And he says, because I need to rebuild my confidence. So I saw him at the end of the summer, and I said, so Fernando, how was it? And he says, I got an A+, and I was tutoring all the other students. It was just what I needed to do. So, we've had to really think hard about what we do. So one of the things we found out is a lot of our students of color, we have a lot of support, tutoring, various other forms of support. They weren't, our faculty love doing office hours. And typically students spend a lot of time with their faculty in office hours. Our students of color were disproportionately not getting help. So we had to put in place something called peer academic liaisons, PALs. And the idea is those are largely students of color and female students who had difficulty in their first year or two, but who have succeeded by the time they're in their third or fourth year. And we realized that having people who had trouble with way better group of people than people who just sailed through in terms of persuading people to get help. So we've had to look at every single thing we do and analyze whether or not the students that we're worried about are actually getting help, and if not so, how can we get them into that? So another thing we did was 2 years ago we started doing an Asking for Help dinner series. So I have dinner with, I invite all the first year students to have dinner with me in groups of 10 to 12, and we have a faculty member and one of the PALs there with us as well. And we talk about why it's hard to ask for help, and then everybody talks about what they actually are asking for help with, as well as other things. And that's also had a really big impact in terms of, I'd say half of our students actually participating in those dinners in the first semester. It's had a big impact in terms of the willingness of talking about getting help.
The joys of a smaller institution. So yeah, thank you for that great story. Question here, and then I'll come back over this side.
You pretty much answered mine, but perhaps just an extension of what you're talking about, Maria, that do you have, or are you thinking of any active pathway programs to encourage more of those brighter students in the underperforming high schools?
We do a lot of outreach. So we do something called Homework Hotline, which was started by Rose Hellman, which is another undergraduate science and engineering school. So we do tutoring for students for math and science homework in 4th through 12th grade for the surrounding areas, particularly in the lower income school districts. We do something called Science Bus, where we take out, this is run by our students, and we take out a bus with science experiments to elementary schools. We do something called West Women in Engineering, Science and Technology, where we invite young women from 10th and 11th grade, plus their parents, because most Hispanic parents don't think of science and engineering as something their students might do. So we bring them and their parents, and we have a program for their parents about, science and engineering careers pay really well. Our median salary last year was $102,000, straight after graduation. So we probably have a half dozen or more of programs like this. We have something on campus called, it's basically, it's called Upward Bound, and it brings probably 60 students each summer of color from low-income neighborhoods on campus, and they get tutoring and information applying to colleges and so on and so forth. So for a tiny place, we actually do a lot. How many of those students actually end up coming to Mudd? We recruit from all across the country as well as all around the world. So we also have programs where we bring in high-performing students of color from all across the country to spend a weekend. We have something called Wisdom, where we work with female students in 11th grade for 9 months. It's an on-campus visit followed by a webinar once a month that's everything about applying for college. So, I mean, we do a lot of this work, but to be really honest, one of the reasons we do this work is because it engages our students in doing it. And one of the things we know for our students, particularly for students who come from underprivileged backgrounds, helping others is a way of building their confidence and affirming them. And so, you know, we do the outreach for the outreach, but we also do it because it's very helpful for actually the student participants.
Thank you. Over here.
Maria, thank you. That was great. I'm just wondering, as you build up your cohort of female or colour students and so on, what happens when they leave, and what happens with jobs, and do they hit a problem there, or are you really changing things by educating students to go out into the workplace and succeed? Because it could be great in a small environment, but then you might hit reality.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think probably everybody here knows that the atmosphere, the culture in Silicon Valley, particularly in startups, is very hostile to women. And there are so few students of color participating that it's going to be hostile for them too, but it's mostly, most of the experiences that you hear about are from women. There's just sexual harassment is pretty rife. And so we also have been working with companies both large and small in terms of trying to transfer the things that we have done to be successful in attracting women and students of color at Mudd to their work environments. I'd say the two companies that are probably doing the most right now are Accenture and Intel. We're about to do actually a survey of alumni over the last 10 years to find out how many are still in Silicon Valley, because I've started to hear anecdotally that we've had a number of female students who've gone and had a really bad graduated, gotten a great paying job, had a bad experience, and within a few years have just left basically technology companies and are doing things like going back and getting a PhD in biostatistics or something like that, where there are more women. I think it's going to be more supportive. So we talk a lot with companies. We are currently Google's favorite place to hire, as well as Microsoft, Facebook, Intel, because of the diversity of our students, but also because our students are extraordinarily high quality students, because it's not just that they know a bunch of science and engineering, but they write well, they collaborate well, they're creative, all of those other things that people, they have a lot of EQ. But there's no question that there's a lot of work to be done in industry. And you know, even within large companies, there are parts of the companies that are really quite supportive, and then other parts that are less supportive. So I have a great story about one of our students, Teal Stannard, who went to Microsoft on an internship last summer. And she was having lunch with Talithia and told Talithia a story about her experience there. And Talithia said, "Did you tell Maria yet?" And Teal said, "No." Talithia says, "Well, you got to go tell Maria." So Teal comes, and the story she tells me is, so she's a third-year computer science student now. And she loved her internship, absolutely fantastic, great manager, great skip-level manager, except that they had a spotlight series showing off Microsoft employees who they thought had been particularly successful. So 8 speakers, how many women? 0. How many people of color? Well, 2 Indians and 6 white males. And so Teal, being Teal, went and complained and was horrified that the organizers of the series didn't take it seriously and didn't think they had a problem. And you know, and Teal herself had collected the names of like 30 women who are high performers at Microsoft and gave them to the organizers. This is a standard Mudd student, right? You know, we make trouble wherever we go. And so she told me about this. So I wrote to the EVP of HR, Kathleen Hogan at Microsoft, and said, "Kathleen, I don't know if you heard about this, but I'm sure you'd want to know if you didn't hear." And of course, she wrote back within 2 hours. She asked for Teal's email address. She wrote and apologized to her. "I'm sure they won't make this mistake next year. They'll just make it someplace else." So, you know, I mean, the problem is I liken the tech industry to my taking ski lessons. So I started taking ski lessons at the age of 59, downhill ski lessons. And, you know, I'm doing pretty well these days, but as soon as I get on a slope that's too steep, I revert right back to my worst habits. And that's what I see happening in the tech industry, is that even when they're really trying to be more supportive of women and people of color, as soon as they have a business challenge, it's way back to the worst behaviors. They put bullies in charge, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a long way to go, but you know, my feeling is unless we change undergraduate education so that we can get a truly diverse group of students ready to enter the workforce, we're never going to change the workforce, because like if there aren't lots of women and lots of people of color going into the workforce, you're never going to change the demographics. But we need to be absolutely vigilant in working with industry to try and make sure that they are doing similar things. So I'll just close with what I tell every person who wants to increase diversity. Number one, make your work environment or your learning environment supportive of everyone. Muslim, Christian, atheist, male, female, everyone. Number two, build confidence and community among your underrepresented groups so they feel welcome and embraced. And number three, demystify the paths to success and create access to the paths for success. Because if you're not a member of the dominant group, you don't have the same knowledge about what the opportunities are. And what I've seen is that the companies that are actually doing this, they're seeing really good progress.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much for those 3 pointers, which I think we'd all agree with. And yes, our students are our future as well. So without them being dynamic and inclusive, nothing will change. Thank you very much for an inspirational Q&A session as well as a presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.